There is this type of a man that wars produce in small numbers, not the man who fights because he has no choice, but the man who fights because he cannot imagine doing anything else. History tends to celebrate this type without fully examining it. We call it courage, dedication, the warrior spirit. We put statues in town squares and name ships after the men who embody it. But occasionally, one of these men leaves behind a record clear enough that we can actually trace the decision-making, the specific moments when he was offered an exit, understood what the exit meant, and declined it. That kind of record is rarer than the statues suggest. This video is presented for historical and educational purposes only. John Basilone left behind exactly that kind of record. To understand what made Basilone's story distinctive, it helps to understand the Pacific Theater in the second half of 1942, what it actually looked like for the men on the ground, and what the United States Marine Corps was being asked to do there. By the middle of that year, Japan had extended its operational reach across an enormous arc of the Pacific. From the Central Pacific Islands down through the Philippines, Malaya, and into the island chains of the Southwest Pacific, the pace and scale of that expansion had caught the Allied command largely off guard. In early August 1942, the Marines landed on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, the first American offensive ground operation of the Pacific War, and almost immediately found themselves in a situation that had not been fully anticipated by the planning that preceded it. By late October, a single Marine battalion was all that stood between Henderson Field and two Japanese regiments. Henderson Field was the strategic center of the entire Guadalcanal campaign. It was the airstrip the Marines had seized from the Japanese in the opening days of the operation, and it was the reason the island mattered. Whoever controlled that airfield controlled the surrounding air and sea. The Japanese understood this as clearly as the Americans did, and through October, they applied sustained, methodical pressure on the Marine perimeter defending it. The conditions inside that perimeter were by any measure extraordinarily demanding. The climate on Guadalcanal, the heat, the rain, the terrain, compounded the operational difficulties. Malaria moved through the Marine units steadily. Resupply was uncertain. The men who held the perimeter did so with equipment that was frequently pushed past its operational limits under conditions that did not allow for adequate rest or recovery. It was in this environment, on the night of October 24, 1942, that John Basilone's section of the perimeter came under concentrated assault. Basilone was a sergeant from Raritan, New Jersey, the son of an Italian immigrant tailor, one of 10 children. He had enlisted in the Army at 18, served 3 years in the Philippines, where he earned the nickname Manila John, and then joined the Marine Corps in 1940, looking for a way back to the Pacific. He was, by the accounts of those who served alongside him, a technically precise and unusually composed machine gunner. He understood the equipment thoroughly. Under pressure, he did not accelerate into recklessness. He slowed down and found the problem. On the night of October 24th, a Japanese regiment numbering 3,000 men attacked the Marine line with waves of assault forces pressing against the perimeter in sustained fashion. Basilone was in command of 2 heavy machine gun sections. When one section was put out of action, he moved to address it, carrying ammunition through the contested ground between positions, restoring the section's operational capacity, and then returning to his own position to continue coordinating the defense. He lost his protective gloves during the engagement The machine gun barrels, operated at the rate required by the assault, reached temperatures that made direct contact genuinely dangerous. He continued without the gloves. By the time the assault had exhausted itself against the Marine perimeter, the Japanese forces opposite the Marines' lines had been virtually annihilated. Of the Marines in Basilon's immediate section, he and 2 others remained at their positions. A fellow Marine who fought beside him that night, Private First Class Nash Phillips, described it afterward with the plainness that combat veterans tend to prefer. Basilone had a machine gun on the go for 3 days and nights without sleep, rest, or food. He was in a good emplacement and causing the Japanese lots of trouble. The Medal of Honor that followed, the first awarded to an enlisted Marine in the Second World War, brought with it consequences that Basilone himself did not seek and, by most accounts, did not particularly welcome. The Marine Corps sent Basilone home to the United States on a countrywide war bond tour. This was standard procedure. A decorated, photogenic, genuinely heroic Marine sergeant was an asset to the war bond effort in ways that went beyond anything he could contribute by remaining in the Pacific. He appeared in newsreels. His image ran in newspapers and magazines. He raised $1.4 million in war bonds. His hometown of Raritan, New Jersey, organized a parade. Crowds gathered wherever he appeared. None of this seemed to suit him particularly well. He privately complained about being a museum piece. He was a warrior. He wanted to get back into the fight. The Marine Corps denied his initial request to return to combat. They offered him a commission as a second lieutenant and an assignment in Washington, D.C. He declined. They offered a role as a gunnery instructor, stateside. He declined that too. He made the request a second time, in words that have been quoted often enough that they have become part of his biography. "I'm just a plain soldier and want to stay one. I ain't no officer and I ain't no museum piece. I belong back with my outfit." Eventually, the Corps relented. What followed before his return to the Pacific was, by the accounts that survive it, one of the quieter chapters of his life. At Camp Pendleton, he met fellow Marine Sergeant Lena Mae Riggy, and the two married in July 1944. There are photographs from that period. A man who appears, by any reasonable reading of the images, to be at ease, not resigned, not melancholy, present. He had what he had asked for, a path back to the Pacific, and in the interval before departure, a life that was, for a few months, genuinely uncomplicated. In December 1944, Basilone returned to the Pacific. He never saw his wife again. The island of Iwo Jima sits approximately 700 miles south of the Japanese mainland. It is a small volcanic island, roughly 8 square miles in total area, with terrain shaped by geology into something that offered almost nothing in the way of natural shelter for an attacker and almost everything a defender could want. By the time the American assault was planned for early 1945, the Japanese garrison had spent months fortifying it, tunneling through the volcanic rock, connecting defensive positions through an underground network, establishing overlapping fields of fire across every viable approach. Over 20,000 Japanese troops defended Iwo Jima. Only approximately 200 are known to have survived the battle. The Marine Corps sustained nearly 26,000 casualties, of whom close to 7,000 did not return. These figures, set against the island's physical dimensions, give some indication of what the fighting there actually represented. Basilone landed with the 1st Battalion, 27th Marine Regiment on February 19, 1945, the first day of the assault. The beach, designated Red Beach 2, was, from the opening moments, extraordinarily difficult. The volcanic sand of Iwo Jima is unlike ordinary beach terrain. It is heavy and loose, offering no firm footing, absorbing the energy of movement in ways that slow everything down. The Japanese defensive positions had been positioned to exploit exactly this, to engage assault forces while they were still in the sand, before they could disperse and find cover. With his unit under concentrated fire and forward movement stalled, Basilone navigated around the flank of a fortified Japanese position and engaged it directly, using demolitions and directing a flamethrower team onto the structure. The position was neutralized. The Marines were able to move forward. He then moved to assist a Marine tank that had become immobilized in a minefield, guiding it through the hazardous ground to safety under sustained fire from Japanese positions. Shortly afterward, a mortar round impacted near his position. John Basilone was 28 years old. He was posthumously awarded the Navy Cross, making him the only enlisted Marine of the Second World War to receive both that decoration and the Medal of Honor. His widow, Lena May, never remarried. She died in 1950, 5 years after her husband, and was buried still wearing her wedding ring. The USS Basilone was commissioned in 1945. A second warship bearing his name entered service decades later. There is a bronze statue in Raritan, New Jersey, on the street where he grew up, and an annual celebration in the town that carries his name forward into a present he never reached. What remains genuinely worth examining at this distance is not the heroism itself, that part of the record is well established, but the decision that preceded Iwo Jima, the decision to return. Basilone had been offered in concrete and institutional terms a way through the rest of the war that did not involve the Pacific. The offer was not symbolic. It was real. It was available, and by any rational framework, it was the reasonable choice. He had already demonstrated, beyond any reasonable standard of measurement, what he was willing to contribute. The War Bond Tour was not a consolation prize. It was genuinely valuable work, and he was genuinely effective at it. He declined anyway, and the historical record does not give us a fully satisfying explanation for why, because Basilone himself did not leave one behind. What he left was a pattern of behavior, consistent, repeated, unambiguous, that pointed in one direction. He understood what returning meant. He had seen Guadalcanal. He had no illusions about what the Pacific Campaign required of the people inside it. He went back regardless. There is a temptation, when writing about men like Basilone, to resolve the story into something clean, a lesson, a moral, a takeaway that makes the arc feel purposeful and complete. But the historical record resists that kind of resolution. What it offers, instead, is something more honest. A man who knew his own mind with unusual clarity, made decisions that were consistent with that clarity, and accepted the consequences of those decisions without apparent ambivalence. The circumstances that surrounded him, the campaign, the island, the beach, the morning of February 19th, were the product of forces far larger than any individual. He was one man inside an operation involving tens of thousands. His contribution on that day, significant as it was in its immediate context, was one thread in something enormous. What distinguished him was not the threat itself, but the fact that he chose to be there at all. The statue in Raritan stands on a street corner, bronze and permanent, looking out over a town that has changed considerably since 1945. It captures a moment, a man in uniform, a specific posture, a specific year. What it cannot capture, and what no statue can, is the quieter part of the story. The morning at Camp Pendleton, when he could have said yes to Washington, and said no instead. That decision happened in a room somewhere, without ceremony, and it is entirely possible that Basilone himself did not experience it as particularly significant in the moment. It may have felt simply like the obvious thing to do. That, perhaps, is the most honest thing the record tells us about him.